Hello, my name is Gary, and I was raised in the western United States, so I'm a native English speaker. I hope that you will enjoy this YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us.
IELTS writing samples. The chart below shows the percentage of people born in and outside of Australia living in cities, towns, and rural areas in 1950 and 2010. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features of the graph and make comparisons where relevant. The chart provides data regarding the proportion of residents residing in city, town, and rural areas in Australia in both 1950 and 2010. It categorizes individuals based on their nationality, distinguishing between those born in Australia and those born elsewhere. Overall, it is apparent that a greater proportion of individuals from both demographic groups resided in cities in both 1950 and 2010. Moreover, there was a noticeable increase in the percentage of city dwellers among both groups over the specified period. In 1950, approximately 50% of Australian-born individuals resided in urban areas, with around 20% residing in towns and approximately 30% living in rural regions. By 2010, the proportion of Australian-born individuals living in cities had risen to approximately 65%, while the percentage residing in towns and rural areas had decreased to slightly over 15% each. Conversely, individuals born outside of Australia constituted approximately 60% of the urban population in 1950, a figure that surged to 80% by 2010. Remarkably, a substantial portion of non-native residents lived in rural areas in 1950, accounting for 40% of the total. However, this percentage dwindled significantly to approximately 5% by 2010.
The chart depicts the percentage of individuals residing in cities, towns, and countryside regions in Australia during the years 1950 and 2010, categorized by their place of birth, whether within Australia or abroad. Overall, it is evident that living in cities was considerably more common for both groups of people in both 1950 and 2010. Furthermore, the percentage of individuals from both groups residing in cities saw a significant increase over the given period. In 1950, roughly half of the Australian-born population lived in cities, while about 20% resided in towns and around 30% dwelled in rural areas. By 2010, the urban population had surged to approximately 65%, while the percentages of individuals residing in towns and rural regions had both declined to just over 15%. In contrast, in 1950, approximately 60% of individuals born outside Australia resided in cities, a proportion that increased to 80% by 2010. Interestingly, a significant portion of non-native residents lived in rural areas in 1950, accounting for 40% of the total. However, this percentage decreased substantially to around 5% by 2010.
The line graph shows the percentage of spending in a European country from 1960 to 2000. The line graph displays the distribution of spending percentages in a European country across various categories such as food, leisure, clothing, transport, and energy from 1960 to 2000. Overall, it is evident that expenditure decreases for all categories except clothing throughout the period. Moreover, while energy accounted for the lowest expenditure, food consistently represented the highest portion of spending. In 1960, food accounted for slightly over 30% of expenditure in this country, representing the highest proportion for that year, followed by leisure expenditure at 20%. However, as the period progressed, spending on food gradually decreased, more than halving by the year 2000 to less than 15%. Similarly, expenditure on leisure experienced a decline over the period, reaching approximately 12% by 2000. Expenditure on transport and energy followed comparable patterns, steadily decreasing over the observed period from 10% and 5% respectively to approximately 5% and 1%. The only category that experienced an increase in expenditure throughout the 40-year period was clothing, which surged from around 9% to 15%.
The line graph portrays the proportion of spending in a European country across various categories, including food, leisure, clothing, transport, and energy from 1960 to 2000. Overall, the data indicates a downward trend in expenditure across all categories except for clothing. Notably, while energy expenses remained relatively low throughout the period, food consistently stood out as the highest expenditure for individuals. In 1960, food accounted for slightly over 30% of the country's expenditure, representing the highest proportion for that year, followed by leisure spending at 20%. However, as the years progressed, spending on food gradually declined, more than halving by the year 2000 to less than 15%. Similarly, expenditure on leisure also decreased over the period, reaching around 12% by 2000. Spending on transport and energy exhibited similar trends, both showing a steady decline over the measured period, decreasing from 10% and 5% respectively to around 5% and 1%. Conversely, the only category that saw an increase in expenditure over the 40-year period was clothing, which rose from approximately 9% to 15%.